Chapter 27. 2 or 3 weeks passed. One morning, having come to a pause in my work, I thought I would give myself a holiday, and I went to the Louvre. I wandered about looking at the pictures I knew so well, and let my fancy play idly with the emotions they suggested. I sauntered into the long gallery, and there suddenly saw Struve. I smiled, for his appearance, so rotund and yet so startled, could never fail to excite a smile. And then as I came nearer, I noticed that he seemed singularly disconsolate. He looked woebegone and yet ridiculous, like a man who has fallen into the water with all his clothes on, and being rescued from death, frightened still, feels that he only looks a fool. Turning round, he stared at me, but I perceived that he did not see me. His round blue eyes looked harassed behind his glasses. "Stroeve," I said. He gave a little start, and then smiled. But his smile was rueful. "Why are you idling in this disgraceful fashion?" I asked gaily. "It's a long time since I was at the Louvre. I thought I'd come and see if they had anything new." "But you told me you had to get a picture finished this week." "Strickland's painting in my studio." "Well?" "I suggested it myself. He's not strong enough to go back to his own place yet. I thought we could both paint there. Lots of fellows in the quarter share a studio. I thought it would be fun. I've always thought it would be jolly to have someone to talk to when one was tired of work." He said all this slowly, detaching statement from statement with a little awkward silence, and he kept his kind, foolish eyes fixed on mine. They were full of tears. "I don't think I understand," I said. "Strickland can't work with anyone else in the studio." "Damn it all, it's your studio. That's his lookout." He looked at me pitifully. His lips were trembling. "What happened?" I asked rather sharply. He hesitated and flushed. He glanced unhappily at one of the pictures on the wall. "He wouldn't let me go on painting. He told me to get out." "But why didn't you tell him to go to hell?" "He turned me out. I couldn't very well struggle with him. He threw my hat after me and locked the door." I was furious with Strickland and was indignant with myself because Dirk Struve cut such an absurd figure that I felt inclined to laugh. "But what did your wife say?" "She'd gone out to do the marketing." "Is he going to let her in?" "I don't know." I gazed at Struve with perplexity. He stood like a schoolboy with whom a master is finding fault. "Shall I get rid of Strickland for you?" I asked. He gave a little start, and his shining face grew very red. "No, you'd better not do anything." He nodded to me and walked away. It was clear that for some reason he did not want to discuss the matter. I did not understand. Chapter 28. The explanation came a week later. It was about 10 o'clock at night. I had been dining by myself at a restaurant, and having returned to my small apartment, was sitting in my parlour. Reading, I heard the cracked tinkling of the bell, and going into the corridor, opened the door. Struve stood before me. "Can I come in?" he asked. In the dimness of the landing I could not see him very well, but there was something in his voice that surprised me. I knew he was of abstemious habit, or I should have thought he had been drinking. I led the way into my sitting room and asked him to sit down. "Thank God I've found you," he said. "What's the matter?" I asked in astonishment at his vehemence. I was able now to see him well. As a rule, he was neat in his person, but now his clothes were in disorder. He looked suddenly bedraggled. I was convinced he had been drinking, and I smiled. I was on the point of chaffing him on his state. "I didn't know where to go," he burst out. "I came here earlier, but you weren't in." "I dined late," I said. I changed my mind. It was not liquor that had driven him to this obvious desperation. His face, usually so rosy, was now strangely mottled. His hands trembled. "Has anything happened?" I asked. "My wife has left me." He could hardly get the words out. He gave a little gasp, and the tears began to trickle down his round cheeks. I did not know what to say. My first thought was that she had come to the end of her forbearance with his infatuation for Strickland, and, goaded by the latter's cynical behaviour, had insisted that he should be turned out. I knew her capable of temper for all the calmness of her manner, and if Stroeve still refused, she might easily have flung out of the studio with vows never to return. But the little man was so distressed that I could not smile. "My dear fellow, don't be unhappy. She'll come back. You mustn't take very seriously what women say when they're in a passion." "You don't understand. She's in love with Strickland." "What?" I was startled at this, but the idea had no sooner taken possession of me than I saw it was absurd. "How can you be so silly? You don't mean to say you're jealous of Strickland?" I almost laughed. "You know very well that she can't bear the sight of him." "You don't understand," he moaned. "You're an hysterical ass," I said a little impatiently. "Let me give you a whiskey and soda, and you'll feel better." I suppose that, for some reason or other, and heaven knows what ingenuity men exercise to torment themselves, Dirk had got it into his head that his wife cared for Strickland, and with his genius for blundering he might quite well have offended her, so that to anger him perhaps she had taken pains to foster his suspicion. "Look here," I said, "let's go back to your studio. If you've made a fool of yourself, you must eat humble pie. Your wife doesn't strike me as the sort of woman to bear malice." "How can I go back to the studio?" he said wearily. "They're there. I've left it to them." "Then it's not your wife who's left you. It's you who've left your wife." "For God's sake, don't talk to me like that." Still, I could not take him seriously. I did not for a moment believe what he had told me, but he was in very real distress. "Well, you've come here to talk to me about it. You'd better tell me the whole story." "This afternoon I couldn't stand it any more. I went to Strickland and told him I thought he was quite well enough to go back to his own place. I wanted the studio myself." "No one but Strickland would have needed telling," I said. "What did he say?" "He laughed a little. You know how he laughs, not as though he were amused, but as though you were a damned fool, and said he'd go at once. He began to put his things together. You remember, I fetched from his room what I thought he needed, and he asked Blanche for a piece of paper and some string to make a parcel." Stroeve stopped, gasping, and I thought he was going to faint. This was not at all the story I had expected him to tell me. She was very pale, but she brought the paper and the string. He didn't say anything. He made the parcel, and he whistled a tune. He took no notice of either of us. His eyes had an ironic smile in them. My heart was like lead. I was afraid something was going to happen, and I wished I hadn't spoken. He looked round for his hat. Then she spoke. "I'm going with Strickland, Dirk," she said. "I can't live with you any more." I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Strickland didn't say anything. He went on whistling as though it had nothing to do with him. Stroeve stopped again and mopped his face. I kept quite still. I believed him now, and I was astounded. But all the same, I could not understand. Then he told me in a trembling voice, with the tears pouring down his cheeks, how he had gone up to her, trying to take her in his arms, but she had drawn away and begged him not to touch her. He implored her not to leave him. He told her how passionately he loved her and reminded her of all the devotion he had lavished upon her. He spoke to her of the happiness of their life. He was not angry with her. He did not reproach her. "Please let me go quietly, Dirk," she said at last. "Don't you understand that I love Strickland? Where he goes, I shall go. But you must know that he'll never make you happy. For your own sake, don't go. You don't know what you've got to look forward to. It's your fault. You insisted on his coming here." He turned to Strickland. "Have mercy on her," he implored him. "You can't let her do anything so mad." "She can do as she chooses," said Strickland. She's not forced to come. My choice is made, she said in a dull voice. Strickland's injurious calm robbed Strove of the rest of his self-control. Blind rage seized him, and without knowing what he was doing, he flung himself on Strickland. Strickland was taken by surprise, and he staggered, but he was very strong, even after his illness, and in a moment, he did not exactly know how, Strove found himself on the floor. "You funny little man," said Strickland. Strove picked himself up. He noticed that his wife had remained perfectly still, and to be made ridiculous before her increased his humiliation. His spectacles had tumbled off in the struggle, and he could not immediately see them. She picked them up and silently handed them to him. He seemed suddenly to realize his unhappiness, and though he knew he was making himself still more absurd, he began to cry. He hid his face in his hands. The others watched him without a word. They did not move from where they stood. "Oh, my dear," he groaned at last, "how can you be so cruel?" "I can't help myself, Dirk," she answered. "I've worshipped you as no woman was ever worshipped before. If in anything I did, I displeased you, why didn't you tell me, and I'd have changed? I've done everything I could for you." She did not answer. Her face was set, and he saw that he was only boring her. She put on a coat and her hat. She moved towards the door, and he saw that in a moment she would be gone. He went up to her quickly and fell on his knees before her, seizing her hands. He abandoned all self-respect. "Oh, don't go, my darling. I can't live without you. I shall kill myself. If I've done anything to offend you, I beg you to forgive me. Give me another chance. I'll try harder still to make you happy." "Get up, Dirk. You're making yourself a perfect fool." He staggered to his feet, but still he would not let her go. "Where are you going?" he said hastily. "You don't know what Strickland's place is like. You can't live there. It would be awful. If I don't care, I don't see why you should." "Stay a minute longer. I must speak. After all, you can't grudge me that." "What is the good? I've made up my mind. Nothing that you can say will make me alter it." He gulped and put his hand to his heart to ease its painful beating. "I'm not going to ask you to change your mind, but I want you to listen to me for a minute. It's the last thing I shall ever ask you. Don't refuse me that." She paused, looking at him with those reflective eyes of hers, which now were so different to him. She came back into the studio and leaned against the table. "Well?" Stroeve made a great effort to collect himself. "You must be a little reasonable. You can't live on air, you know. Strickland hasn't got a penny." "I know." "You'll suffer the most awful privations. You know why he took so long to get well. He was half-starved." "I can earn money for him." "How?" "I don't know. I shall find a way." A horrible thought passed through the Dutchman's mind, and he shuddered. "I think you must be mad. I don't know what has come over you." She shrugged her shoulders. "Now may I go?" "Wait 1 second longer." He looked round his studio wearily. He had loved it because her presence had made it gay and homelike. He shut his eyes for an instant, then he gave her a long look as though to impress on his mind the picture of her. He got up and took his hat. "No, I'll go." "You?" She was startled. She did not know what he meant. "I can't bear to think of you living in that horrible, filthy attic. After all, this is your home just as much as mine. You'll be comfortable here. You'll be spared at least the worst privations." He went to the drawer in which he kept his money and took out several banknotes. "I would like to give you half what I've got here." He put them on the table. Neither Strickland nor his wife spoke. Then he recollected something else. "Will you pack up my clothes and leave them with the concierge? I'll come and fetch them tomorrow." He tried to smile. "Goodbye, my dear. I'm grateful for all the happiness you gave me in the past." He walked out and closed the door behind him. With my mind's eye, I saw Strickland throw his hat on a table and, sitting down, begin to smoke a cigarette. Chapter 29. I kept silence for a little while, thinking of what Stroeve had told me. I could not stomach his weakness, and he saw my disapproval. "You know as well as I do how Strickland lived," he said tremulously. "I couldn't let her live in those circumstances. I simply couldn't." "And that's your business," I answered. "What would you have done?" he asked. She went with her eyes open. If she had to put up with certain inconveniences, it was her own lookout. "Yes, but you see, you don't love her." "Do you love her still?" "Oh, more than ever. Strickland isn't the man to make a woman happy. It can't last. I want her to know that I shall never fail her." Does that mean that you're prepared to take her back?" "I shouldn't hesitate. Why, she'll want me more than ever then. When she's alone and humiliated and broken, it would be dreadful if she had nowhere to go." He seemed to bear no resentment. I suppose it was commonplace in me that I felt slightly outraged at his lack of spirit. Perhaps he guessed what was in my mind, for he said, "I couldn't expect her to love me as I loved her. I'm a buffoon. I'm not the sort of man that women love. I've always known that. I can't blame her if she's fallen in love with Strickland." "You certainly have less vanity than any man I've ever known," I said. "I love her so much better than myself. It seems to me that when vanity comes into love, it can only be because really you love yourself best. After all, it constantly happens that a man, when he's married, falls in love with somebody else. When he gets over it, he returns to his wife and she takes him back, and everyone thinks it very natural. Why should it be different with women?" "I dare say that's logical," I smiled, "but most men are made differently, and they can't." But while I talked to Stroeve, I was puzzling over the suddenness of the whole affair. I could not imagine that he had had no warning. I remembered the curious look I had seen in Blanche Stroeve's eyes. Perhaps its explanation was that she was growing dimly conscious of a feeling in her heart that surprised and alarmed her. "Did you have no suspicion before today that there was anything between them?" I asked. He did not answer for a while. There was a pencil on the table, and unconsciously he drew a head on the blotting paper. "Please say so if you hate my asking you questions," I said. "It eases me to talk. Oh, if you knew the frightful anguish in my heart." He threw the pencil down. "Yes, I've known it for a fortnight. I knew it before she did." "Why on earth didn't you send Strickland packing?" "I couldn't believe it. It seemed so improbable. She couldn't bear the sight of him. It was more than improbable. It was incredible. I thought it was merely jealousy. You see, I've always been jealous, but I trained myself never to show it. I was jealous of every man she knew. I was jealous of you. I knew she didn't love me as I loved her. That was only natural, wasn't it? But she allowed me to love her, and that was enough to make me happy. I forced myself to go out for hours together in order to leave them by themselves. I wanted to punish myself for suspicions which were unworthy of me. And when I came back, I found they didn't want me. Not Strickland, he didn't care if I was there or not, but Blanche. She shuddered when I went to kiss her. When at last I was certain I didn't know what to do, I knew they'd only laugh at me if I made a scene. I thought if I held my tongue and pretended not to see, everything would come right. I made up my mind to get him away quietly, without quarreling. Oh, if you only knew what I've suffered. Then he told me again of his asking Strickland to go. He chose his moment carefully and tried to make his request sound casual, but he could not master the trembling of his voice, and he felt himself that into words that he wished to seem jovial and friendly there crept the bitterness of his jealousy. He had not expected Strickland to take him up on the spot and make his preparations to go there and then. Above all, he had not expected his wife's decision to go with him. I saw that now he wished with all his heart that he had held his tongue. He preferred the anguish of jealousy to the anguish of separation. I wanted to kill him, and I only made a fool of myself. He was silent for a long time, and then he said what I knew was in his mind. If I'd only waited, perhaps it would have gone all right. I shouldn't have been so impatient. Oh, poor child, what have I driven her to? I shrugged my shoulders, but did not speak. I had no sympathy for Blanche Stroeve, but knew that it would only pain poor Dirk if I told him exactly what I thought of her. He had reached that stage of exhaustion when he could not stop talking. He went over again every word of the scene. Now something occurred to him that he had not told me before. Now he discussed what he ought to have said instead of what he did say. Then he lamented his blindness. He regretted that he had done this, and blamed himself that he had omitted the other. It grew later and later, and at last I was as tired as he. "What are you going to do now?" I said finally. "What can I do? I shall wait till she sends for me." "Why don't you go away for a bit?" "No, no. I must be at hand when she wants me." For the present, he seemed quite lost. He had made no plans. When I suggested that he should go to bed, he said he could not sleep. He wanted to go out and walk about the streets till day. He was evidently in no state to be left alone. I persuaded him to stay the night with me, and I put him into my own bed. I had a divan in my sitting room and could very well sleep on that. He was by now so worn out that he could not resist my firmness. I gave him a sufficient dose of veronal to ensure his unconsciousness for several hours. I thought that was the best service I could render him. Chapter 30. But the bed I made up for myself was sufficiently uncomfortable to give me a wakeful night, and I thought a good deal of what the unlucky Dutchman had told me. I was not so much puzzled by Blanche Stroeve's action, for I saw in that merely the result of a physical appeal. I do not suppose she had ever really cared for her husband, and what I had taken for love was no more than the feminine response to caresses and comfort which in the minds of most women passes for it. It is a passive feeling capable of being roused for any object as the vine can grow on any tree, and the wisdom of the world recognizes its strength when it urges a girl to marry the man who wants her with the assurance that love will follow. It is an emotion made up of the satisfaction in security, pride of property, the pleasure of being desired, the gratification of a household, and it is only by an amiable vanity that women ascribe to it spiritual value. It is an emotion which is defenseless against passion. I suspected that Blanche Stroeve's violent dislike of Strickland had in it from the beginning a vague element of sexual attraction. Who am I that I should seek to unravel the mysterious intricacies of sex? Perhaps Stroeve's passion excited without satisfying that part of her nature, and she hated Strickland because she felt in him the power to give her what she needed. I think she was quite sincere when she struggled against her husband's desire to bring him into the studio. I think she was frightened of him, though she knew not why. And I remembered how she had foreseen disaster. I think in some curious way the horror which she felt for him was a transference of the horror which she felt for herself because he so strangely troubled her. His appearance was wild and uncouth. There was aloofness in his eyes and sensuality in his mouth. He was big and strong. He gave the impression of untamed passion, and perhaps she felt in him, too, that sinister element which had made me think of those wild beings of the world's early history when matter, retaining its early connection with the earth, seemed to possess yet a spirit of its own. If he affected her at all, it was inevitable that she should love or hate him. She hated him. And then I fancy that the daily intimacy with the sick man moved her strangely. She raised his head to give him food, and it was heavy against her hand. When she had fed him, she wiped his sensual mouth and his red beard. She washed his limbs. They were covered with thick hair, and when she dried his hands, even in his weakness, they were strong and sinewy. His fingers were long. They were the capable, fashioning fingers of the artist, and I know not what troubling thoughts they excited in her. He slept very quietly, without a movement, so that he might have been dead, and he was like some wild creature of the woods, resting after a long chase, and she wondered what fancies passed through his dreams. Did he dream of the nymph flying through the woods of Greece with the satyr in hot pursuit? She fled, swift of foot and desperate, but he gained on her step by step, till she felt his hot breath on her neck. And still she fled silently, and silently he pursued, and when at last he seized her, was it terror that thrilled her heart, or was it ecstasy? Blanche Stroeve was in the cruel grip of appetite. Perhaps she hated Strickland still, but she hungered for him, and everything that had made up her life till then became of no account. She ceased to be a woman, complex, kind and petulant, considerate and thoughtless. She was a Maynard. She was desire. But perhaps this is very fanciful, and it may be that she was merely bored with her husband and went to Strickland out of a callous curiosity. She may have had no particular feeling for him, but succumbed to his wish from propinquity or idleness, to find then that she was powerless in a snare of her own contriving. How did I know what were the thoughts and emotions behind that placid brow and those cool grey eyes? But if one could be certain of nothing in dealing with creatures so incalculable as human beings, there were explanations of Blanche Stroeve's behaviour which were at all events plausible. On the other hand, I did not understand Strickland at all. I racked my brain, but could in no way account for an action so contrary to my conception of him. It was not strange that he should so heartlessly have betrayed his friend's confidence, nor that he hesitated not at all to gratify a whim at the cost of another's misery. That was in his character. He was a man without any conception of gratitude. He had no compassion. The emotions common to most of us simply did not exist in him, and it was as absurd to blame him for not feeling them as for blaming the tiger because he is fierce and cruel. But it was the whim I could not understand. I could not believe that Strickland had fallen in love with Blanche Stroeve. I did not believe him capable of love. That is an emotion in which tenderness is an essential part. But Strickland had no tenderness either for himself or for others. There is in love a sense of weakness, a desire to protect, an eagerness to do good and to give pleasure, if not unselfishness, at all events a selfishness which marvellously conceals itself. It has in it a certain diffidence. These were not traits which I could imagine in Strickland. Love is absorbing. It takes the lover out of himself. The most clear-sighted, though he may know, cannot realize that his love will cease. It gives body to what he knows is illusion, and knowing it is nothing else, he loves it better than reality. It makes a man a little more than himself, and at the same time a little less. He ceases to be himself. He is no longer an individual, but a thing, an instrument to some purpose foreign to his ego. Love is never quite devoid of sentimentality, and Strickland was the least inclined to that infirmity of any man I have known. I could not believe that he would ever suffer that possession of himself which love is. He could never endure a foreign yoke. I believed him capable of uprooting from his heart, though it might be with agony, so that he was left battered and ensanguined, anything that came between himself and that uncomprehended craving that urged him constantly to he knew not what. If I have succeeded at all in giving the complicated impression that Strickland made on me, it will not seem outrageous to say that I felt he was at once too great and too small for love. But I suppose that everyone's conception of the passion is formed on his own idiosyncrasies, and it is different with every different person. A man like Strickland would love in a manner peculiar to himself. It was vain to seek the analysis of his emotion. Chapter 31. Next day, though I pressed him to remain, Stroeve left me. I offered to fetch his things from the studio, but he insisted on going himself. I think he hoped they had not thought of getting them together, so that he would have an opportunity of seeing his wife again, and perhaps inducing her to come back to him. But he found his traps waiting for him in the porter's lodge, and the concierge told him that Blanche had gone out. I do not think he resisted the temptation of giving her an account of his troubles. I found that he was telling them to everyone he knew. He expected sympathy, but only excited ridicule. He bore himself most unbecomingly. Knowing at what time his wife did her shopping, one day, unable any longer to bear not seeing her, he waylaid her in the street. She would not speak to him, but he insisted on speaking to her. He spluttered out words of apology for any wrong he had committed towards her. He told her he loved her devotedly and begged her to return to him. She would not answer. She walked hurriedly with averted face. I imagined him with his fat little legs trying to keep up with her. Panting a little in his haste, he told her how miserable he was. He besought her to have mercy on him. He promised, if she would forgive him, to do everything she wanted. He offered to take her for a journey. He told her that Strickland would soon tire of her. When he repeated to me the whole sordid little scene, I was outraged. He had shown neither sense nor dignity. He had omitted nothing that could make his wife despise him. There is no cruelty greater than a woman's to a man who loves her and whom she does not love. She has no kindness then, no tolerance even. She has only an insane irritation. Blanche Stroeve stopped suddenly and as hard as she could slapped her husband's face. She took advantage of his confusion to escape and ran up the stairs to the studio. No word had passed her lips. When he told me this, he put his hand to his cheek as though he still felt the smart of the blow, and in his eyes was a pain that was heart-rending and an amazement that was ludicrous. He looked like an overblown schoolboy, and though I felt so sorry for him, I could hardly help laughing. Then he took to walking along the street which she must pass through to get to the shops, and he would stand at the corner on the other side as she went along. He dared not speak to her again, but sought to put into his round eyes the appeal that was in his heart. I suppose he had some idea that the sight of his misery would touch her. She never made the smallest sign that she saw him. She never even changed the hour of her errands or sought an alternative route. I have an idea that there was some cruelty in her indifference. Perhaps she got enjoyment out of the torture she inflicted. I wondered why she hated him so much. I begged Stroeve to behave more wisely. His want of spirit was exasperating. "You're doing no good at all by going on like this," I said. "I think you'd have been wiser if you'd hit her over the head with a stick. She wouldn't have despised you as she does now." I suggested that he should go home for a while. He had often spoken to me of the silent town, somewhere up in the north of Holland, where his parents still lived. They were poor people. His father was a carpenter, and they dwelt in a little old red brick house, neat and clean, by the side of a sluggish canal. The streets were wide and empty. For 200 years the place had been dying, but the houses had the homely stateliness of their time. Rich merchants, sending their wares to the distant Indies, had lived in them calm and prosperous lives, and in their decent decay they kept still an aroma of their splendid past. You could wander along the canal till you came to broad green fields, with windmills here and there, in which cattle, black and white, grazed lazily. I thought that among those surroundings, with their recollections of his boyhood, Dirk Stroeve would forget his unhappiness. But he would not go. "I must be here when she needs me," he repeated. "It would be dreadful if something terrible happened, and I were not at hand." "What do you think is going to happen?" I asked. "I don't know, but I'm afraid." I shrugged my shoulders. For all his pain, Dirk Stroeve remained a ridiculous object. He might have excited sympathy if he had grown worn and thin. He did nothing of the kind. He remained fat, and his round, red cheeks shone like ripe apples. He had great neatness of person, and he continued to wear his spruce black coat and his bowler hat, always a little too small for him, in a dapper, jaunty manner. He was getting something of a paunch, and sorrow had no effect on it. He looked more than ever like a prosperous bagman. It is hard that a man's exterior should tally so little sometimes with his soul. Dirk Stroeve had the passion of Romeo in the body of Sir Toby Belch. He had a sweet and generous nature, and yet was always blundering. A real feeling for what was beautiful, and the capacity to create only what was commonplace. A peculiar delicacy of sentiment and gross manners. He could exercise tact when dealing with the affairs of others, but none when dealing with his own. What a cruel practical joke old Nature played when she flung so many contradictory elements together and left the man face to face with the perplexing callousness of the universe. Chapter 32. I did not see Strickland for several weeks. I was disgusted with him, and if I had had an opportunity, should have been glad to tell him so, but I saw no object in seeking him out for the purpose. I am a little shy of any assumption of moral indignation. There is always in it an element of self-satisfaction which makes it awkward to anyone who has a sense of humor. It requires a very lively passion to steel me to my own ridicule. There was a sardonic sincerity in Strickland which made me sensitive to anything that might suggest a pose. But one evening, when I was passing along the Avenue de Clichy in front of the café which Strickland frequented, and which I now avoided, I ran straight into him. He was accompanied by Blanche Stroeve, and they were just going to Strickland's favourite corner. "Where the devil have you been all this time?" said he. "I thought you must be away." His cordiality was proof that he knew I had no wish to speak to him. He was not a man with whom it was worth while wasting politeness. "No," I said, "I haven't been away." "Why haven't you been here?" There are more cafes in Paris than one, at which to trifle away an idle hour. Blanche then held out her hand and bade me good evening. I do not know why I had expected her to be somehow changed. She wore the same grey dress that she wore so often, neat and becoming, and her brow was as candid, her eyes as untroubled, as when I had been used to see her occupied with her household duties in the studio. "Come and have a game of chess," said Strickland. I do not know why at the moment I could think of no excuse. I followed them rather sulkily to the table at which Strickland always sat, and he called for the board and the chessmen. They both took the situation so much as a matter of course that I felt it absurd to do otherwise. Mrs. Stroeve watched the game with inscrutable face. She was silent, but she had always been silent. I looked at her mouth for an expression that could give me a clue to what she felt. I watched her eyes for some telltale flash, some hint of dismay or bitterness. I scanned her brow for any passing line that might indicate a settling emotion. Her face was a mask that told nothing. Her hands lay on her lap, motionless, one in the other loosely clasped. I knew from what I had heard that she was a woman of violent passions, and that injurious blow that she had given Dirk, the man who had loved her so devotedly, betrayed a sudden temper and a horrid cruelty. She had abandoned the safe shelter of her husband's protection and the comfortable ease of a well-provided establishment for what she could not but see was an extreme hazard. It showed an eagerness for adventure, a readiness for the hand-to-mouth, which the care she took of her home and her love of good housewifery made not a little remarkable. She must be a woman of complicated character, and there was something dramatic in the contrast of that with her demure appearance. I was excited by the encounter, and my fancy worked busily while I sought to concentrate myself on the game I was playing. I always tried my best to beat Strickland, because he was a player who despised the opponent he vanquished. His exultation in victory made defeat more difficult to bear. On the other hand, if he was beaten, he took it with complete good humor. He was a bad winner and a good loser. Those who think that a man betrays his character nowhere more clearly than when he is playing a game might on this draw subtle inferences. When he had finished, I called the waiter to pay for the drinks and left them. The meeting had been devoid of incident. No word had been said to give me anything to think about, and any surmises I might make were unwarranted. I was intrigued. I could not tell how they were getting on. I would have given much to be a disembodied spirit so that I could see them in the privacy of the studio and hear what they talked about. I had not the smallest indication on which to let my imagination work. Chapter 33. 2 or 3 days later, Dirk Stroeve called on me. "I hear you've seen Blanche," he said. "How on earth did you find out?" "I was told by someone who saw you sitting with them. Why didn't you tell me?" "I thought it would only pain you." "What do I care if it does? You must know that I want to hear the smallest thing about her." I waited for him to ask me questions. "What does she look like?" he said. "Absolutely unchanged." "Does she seem happy?" I shrugged my shoulders. "How can I tell? We were in a cafe. We were playing chess. I had no opportunity to speak to her." "Oh, but couldn't you tell by her face?" I shook my head. I could only repeat that by no word, by no hinted gesture, had she given an indication of her feelings. He must know better than I how great were her powers of self-control. He clasped his hands emotionally. "Oh, I'm so frightened. I know something is going to happen, something terrible, and I can do nothing to stop it." "What sort of thing?" I asked. "Oh, I don't know," he moaned, seizing his head with his hands. "I foresee some terrible catastrophe." Stroeve had always been excitable, but now he was beside himself. There was no reasoning with him. I thought it probable enough that Blanche Stroeve would not continue to find life with Strickland tolerable, but one of the falsest of proverbs is that you must lie on the bed that you have made. The experience of life shows that people are constantly doing things which must lead to disaster, and yet by some chance manage to evade the result of their folly. When Blanche quarrelled with Strickland, she had only to leave him, and her husband was waiting humbly to forgive and forget. I was not prepared to feel any great sympathy for her. "You see, you don't love her," said Stroeve. "And after all, there's nothing to prove that she is unhappy. For all we know, they may have settled down into a most domestic couple." Stroeve gave me a look with his woeful eyes. "Of course it doesn't much matter to you, but to me, it's so serious, so intensely serious." I was sorry if I had seemed impatient or flippant. "Will you do something for me?" asked Stroeve. "Willingly." "Will you write to Blanche for me?" "Why can't you write yourself?" "I've written over and over again. I didn't expect her to answer. I don't think she reads the letters." "You make no account of feminine curiosity. Do you think she could resist?" "She could. Mine." I looked at him quickly. He lowered his eyes. That answer of his seemed to me strangely humiliating. He was conscious that she regarded him with an indifference so profound that the sight of his handwriting would have not the slightest effect on her. "Do you really believe that she'll ever come back to you?" I asked. "And I want her to know that if the worst comes to the worst, she can count on me. That's what I want you to tell her." I took a sheet of paper. "What is it exactly you wish me to say?" This is what I wrote. "Dear Mrs. Stroeve, Dirk wishes me to tell you that if at any time you want him, he will be grateful for the opportunity of being of service to you. He has no ill feeling towards you on account of anything that has happened. His love for you is unaltered. You will always find him at the following address." Chapter 34. But though I was no less convinced than Stroeve that the connection between Strickland and Blanche would end disastrously, I did not expect the issue to take the tragic form it did. The summer came, breathless and sultry, and even at night there was no coolness to rest one's jaded nerves. The sun-baked streets seemed to give back the heat that had beat down on them during the day, and the passers-by dragged their feet along them wearily. I had not seen Strickland for weeks. Occupied with other things, I had ceased to think of him and his affairs. Dirk, with his vain lamentations, had begun to bore me, and I avoided his society. It was a sordid business, and I was not inclined to trouble myself with it further. One morning I was working. I sat in my pajamas. My thoughts wandered, and I thought of the sunny beaches of Brittany and the freshness of the sea. By my side was the empty bowl in which the concierge had brought me my café au lait and the fragment of croissant which I had not had appetite enough to eat. I heard the concierge in the next room emptying my bath. There was a tinkle at my bell, and I left her to open the door. In a moment I heard Strove's voice asking if I was in. Without moving, I shouted to him to come. He entered the room quickly and came up to the table at which I sat. "She's killed herself," he said hoarsely. "What do you mean?" I cried, startled. He made movements with his lips as though he was speaking, but no sound issued from them. He gibbered like an idiot. My heart thumped against my ribs, and I do not know why. I flew into a temper. "For God's sake, collect yourself, man," I said. "What on earth are you talking about?" He made despairing gestures with his hands, but still no words came from his mouth. He might have been struck dumb. I do not know what came over me. I took him by the shoulders and shook him. Looking back, I am vexed that I made such a fool of myself. I suppose the last restless nights had shaken my nerves more than I knew. "Let me sit down," he gasped at length. I filled a glass with St. Galmier and gave it to him to drink. I held it to his mouth as though he were a child. He gulped down a mouthful, and some of it was spilt on his shirt front. "Who's killed herself?" I do not know why I asked, for I knew whom he meant. He made an effort to collect himself. "They had a row last night. He went away." "Is she dead?" "No. They've taken her to the hospital." "Then what are you talking about?" I cried impatiently. "Why did you say she'd killed herself?" "Don't be cross with me. I can't tell you anything if you talk to me like that." I clenched my hands, seeking to control my irritation. I attempted a smile. "I'm sorry. Take your time. Don't hurry. There's a good fellow." His round blue eyes behind the spectacles were ghastly with terror. The magnifying glasses he wore distorted them. When the concierge went up this morning to take a letter, she could get no answer to her ring. She heard someone groaning. The door wasn't locked, and she went in. Blanche was lying on the bed. She'd been frightfully sick. There was a bottle of oxalic acid on the table. Stroeve hid his face in his hands and swayed backwards and forwards, groaning. "Was she conscious?" "Yes." "Oh, if you knew how she's suffering. I can't bear it. I can't bear it." His voice rose to a shriek. "Damn it all, you haven't got to bear it," I cried impatiently. "She's got to bear it. How can you be so cruel?" "What have you done?" "They sent for a doctor and for me, and they told the police. I'd given the concierge 20 francs and told her to send for me if anything happened." He paused a minute, and I saw that what he had to tell me was very hard to say. "When I went, she wouldn't speak to me. She told them to send me away. I swore that I forgave her everything, but she wouldn't listen. She tried to beat her head against the wall. The doctor told me that I mustn't remain with her. She kept on saying, 'Send him away.' I went and waited in the studio, and when the ambulance came and they put her on a stretcher, they made me go in the kitchen so that she shouldn't know I was there. While I dressed, for Stroeve wished me to go at once with him to the hospital, he told me that he had arranged for his wife to have a private room, so that she might at least be spared the sordid promiscuity of a ward. On our way, he explained to me why he desired my presence. If she still refused to see him, perhaps she would see me. He begged me to repeat to her that he loved her still. He would reproach her for nothing, but desired only to help her. He made no claim on her, and on her recovery would not seek to induce her to return to him. She would be perfectly free. But when we arrived at the hospital, a gaunt, cheerless building, the mere sight of which was enough to make one's heart sick, and after being directed from this official to that, up endless stairs and through long, bare corridors, found the doctor in charge of the case. We were told that the patient was too ill to see anyone that day. The doctor was a little bearded man in white, with an offhand manner. He evidently looked upon a case as a case, and anxious relatives as a nuisance which must be treated with firmness. Moreover, to him, the affair was commonplace. It was just an hysterical woman who had quarrelled with her lover and taken poison. It was constantly happening. At first he thought that Dirk was the cause of the disaster, and he was needlessly brusque with him. When I explained that he was the husband, anxious to forgive, the doctor looked at him suddenly, with curious, searching eyes. I seemed to see in them a hint of mockery. It was true that Stroeve had the head of the husband who is deceived. The doctor faintly shrugged his shoulders. "There is no immediate danger," he said, in answer to our questioning. "One doesn't know how much she took. It may be that she will get off with a fright. Women are constantly trying to commit suicide for love, but generally they take care not to succeed. It's generally a gesture to arouse pity or terror in their lover." There was in his tone a frigid contempt. It was obvious that to him, Blanche Stroeve was only a unit to be added to the statistical list of attempted suicides in the city of Paris during the current year. He was busy and could waste no more time on us. He told us that if we came at a certain hour next day, should Blanche be better, it might be possible for her husband to see her. Chapter 35. I scarcely know how we got through that day. Stroeve could not bear to be alone, and I exhausted myself in efforts to distract him. I took him to the Louvre, and he pretended to look at pictures, but I saw that his thoughts were constantly with his wife. I forced him to eat, and after luncheon I induced him to lie down, but he could not sleep. He accepted willingly my invitation to remain for a few days in my apartment. I gave him books to read, but after a page or two he would put the book down and stare miserably into space. During the evening we played innumerable games of piquet, and bravely, not to disappoint my efforts, he tried to appear interested. Finally I gave him a draught, and he sank into uneasy slumber. When we went again to the hospital, we saw a nursing sister. She told us that Blanche seemed a little better, and she went in to ask if she would see her husband. We heard voices in the room in which she lay, and presently the nurse returned to say that the patient refused to see anyone. We had told her that if she refused to see Dirk, the nurse was to ask if she would see me. But this she refused also. Dirk's lips trembled. "I dare not insist," said the nurse. "She is too ill. Perhaps in a day or two she may change her mind." "Is there anyone else she wants to see?" asked Dirk, in a voice so low it was almost a whisper. "She says she only wants to be left in peace." Dirk's hands moved strangely, as though they had nothing to do with his body, with a movement of their own. "Will you tell her that if there is anyone else she wishes to see, I will bring him? I only want her to be happy." The nurse looked at him with her calm, kind eyes, which had seen all the horror and pain of the world, and yet, filled with the vision of a world without sin, remained serene. "I will tell her when she is a little calmer." Dirk, filled with compassion, begged her to take the message at once. "It may cure her. I beseech you to ask her now." With a faint smile of pity, the nurse went back into the room. We heard her low voice, and then, in a voice I did not recognize, the answer, "No, no, no." The nurse came out again and shook her head. "Was that she who spoke then?" I asked. Her voice sounded so strange. "It appears that her vocal cords have been burnt by the acid." Dirk gave a low cry of distress. I asked him to go on and wait for me at the entrance, for I wanted to say something to the nurse. He did not ask what it was, but went silently. He seemed to have lost all power of will. He was like an obedient child. "Has she told you why she did it?" I asked. "No, she won't speak. She lies on her back quite quietly. She doesn't move for hours at a time. But she cries always. Her pillow is all wet. She's too weak to use a handkerchief, and the tears just run down her face." It gave me a sudden wrench of the heartstrings. I could have killed Strickland then, and I knew that my voice was trembling when I bade the nurse goodbye. I found Dirk waiting for me on the steps. He seemed to see nothing, and did not notice that I had joined him till I touched him on the arm. We walked along in silence. I tried to imagine what had happened to drive the poor creature to that dreadful step. I presumed that Strickland knew what had happened, for someone must have been to see him from the police, and he must have made his statement. I did not know where he was. I supposed he had gone back to the shabby attic which served him as a studio. It was curious that she should not wish to see him. Perhaps she refused to have him sent for because she knew he would refuse to come. I wondered what an abyss of cruelty she must have looked into that, in horror, she refused to live. Chapter 36. The next week was dreadful. Stroeve went twice a day to the hospital to inquire after his wife, who still declined to see him, and came away at first relieved and hopeful because he was told that she seemed to be growing better, and then in despair because, the complication which the doctor had feared having ensued, recovery was impossible. The nurse was pitiful to his distress, but she had little to say that could console him. The poor woman lay quite still, refusing to speak, with her eyes intent, as though she watched for the coming of death. It could now be only the question of a day or two, and when, late one evening, Stroeve came to see me, I knew it was to tell me she was dead. He was absolutely exhausted. His volubility had left him at last, and he sank down wearily on my sofa. I felt that no words of condolence availed, and I let him lie there quietly. I feared he would think it heartless if I read, so I sat by the window, smoking a pipe, till he felt inclined to speak. "You've been very kind to me," he said at last. "Everyone's been very kind." "Nonsense," I said, a little embarrassed. "At the hospital they told me I might wait. They gave me a chair, and I sat outside the door. When she became unconscious, they said I might go in. Her mouth and chin were all burnt by the acid. It was awful to see her lovely skin all wounded. She died very peacefully, so that I didn't know she was dead till the sister told me." He was too tired to weep. He lay on his back limply, as though all the strength had gone out of his limbs, and presently I saw that he had fallen asleep. It was the first natural sleep he had had for a week. Nature, sometimes so cruel, is sometimes merciful. I covered him and turned down the light. In the morning, when I awoke, he was still asleep. He had not moved. His gold-rimmed spectacles were still on his nose. Chapter 37. The circumstances of Blanche Stroeve's death necessitated all manner of dreadful formalities, but at last we were allowed to bury her. Dirk and I alone followed the hearse to the cemetery. We went at a foot-pace, but on the way back we trotted, and there was something to my mind singularly horrible in the way the driver of the hearse whipped up his horses. It seemed to dismiss the dead with a shrug of the shoulders. Now and then I caught sight of the swaying hearse in front of us, and our own driver urged his pair so that we might not remain behind. I felt in myself, too, the desire to get the whole thing out of my mind. I was beginning to be bored with a tragedy that did not really concern me, and pretending to myself that I spoke in order to distract Stroeve, I turned with relief to other subjects. "Don't you think you'd better go away for a bit?" I said. "There can be no object in your staying in Paris now." He did not answer, but I went on ruthlessly. "Have you made any plans for the immediate future?" "No." "You must try and gather together the threads again. Why don't you go down to Italy and start working?" Again he made no reply, But the driver of our carriage came to my rescue. Slackening his pace for a moment, he leaned over and spoke. I could not hear what he said, so I put my head out of the window. He wanted to know where we wished to be set down. I told him to wait a minute. You'd better come and have lunch with me, I said to Dirk. I'll tell him to drop us in the Place Pigalle. I'd rather not. I want to go to the studio. I hesitated a moment. Would you like me to come with you? I asked then. No, I should prefer to be alone. All right. I gave the driver the necessary direction, and in renewed silence, we drove on. Dirk had not been to the studio since the wretched morning on which they had taken Blanche to the hospital. I was glad he did not want me to accompany him, and when I left him at the door, I walked away with relief. I took a new pleasure in the streets of Paris, and I looked with smiling eyes at the people who hurried to and fro. The day was fine and sunny, and I felt in myself a more acute delight in life. I couldn't help it. I put Stroeve and his sorrows out of my mind. I wanted to enjoy. Chapter 38. I did not see him again for nearly a week. Then he fetched me soon after 7 one evening and took me out to dinner. He was dressed in the deepest mourning, and on his bowler was a broad black band. He had even a black border to his handkerchief. His garb of woe suggested that he had lost in one catastrophe every relation he had in the world, even to cousins by marriage twice removed. His plumpness and his red, fat cheeks made his mourning not a little incongruous. It was cruel that his extreme unhappiness should have in it something of buffoonery. He told me he had made up his mind to go away, though not to Italy, as I had suggested, but to Holland. I'm starting tomorrow. This is perhaps the last time we shall ever meet. I made an appropriate rejoinder, and he smiled wanly. I haven't been home for 5 years. I think I'd forgotten it all. I seemed to have come so far away from my father's house that I was shy at the idea of revisiting it, but now I feel it's my only refuge. He was sore and bruised, and his thoughts went back to the tenderness of his mother's love. The ridicule he had endured for years seemed now to weigh him down, and the final blow of Blanche's treachery had robbed him of the resiliency which had made him take it so gaily. He could no longer laugh with those who laughed at him. He was an outcast. He told me of his childhood in the tidy brick house and of his mother's passionate orderliness. Her kitchen was a miracle of clean brightness. Everything was always in its place, and nowhere could you see a speck of dust. Cleanliness, indeed, was a mania with her. I saw a neat little old woman with cheeks like apples, toiling away from morning to night through the long years to keep her house trim and spruce. His father was a spare old man, his hands gnarled after the work of a lifetime, silent and upright. In the evening he read the paper aloud, while his wife and daughter, now married to the captain of a fishing smack, unwilling to lose a moment, bent over their sewing. Nothing ever happened in that little town, left behind by the advance of civilization, and 1 year followed the next, till death came like a friend to give rest to those who had labored so diligently. My father wished me to become a carpenter like himself. For 5 generations we've carried on the same trade, from father to son. Perhaps that is the wisdom of life, to tread in your father's steps and look neither to the right nor to the left. When I was a little boy, I said I would marry the daughter of the harness maker who lived next door. She was a little girl with blue eyes and a flaxen pigtail. She would have kept my house like a new pin, and I should have had a son to carry on the business after me. Stroeve sighed a little and was silent. His thoughts dwelt among pictures of what might have been, and the safety of the life he had refused filled him with longing. The world is hard and cruel. We are here none knows why, and we go none knows whither. We must be very humble. We must see the beauty of quietness. We must go through life so inconspicuously that fate does not notice us, and let us seek the love of simple, ignorant people. Their ignorance is better than all our knowledge. Let us be silent, content in our little corner, meek and gentle like them. That is the wisdom of life. To me, it was his broken spirit that expressed itself, and I rebelled against his renunciation. But I kept my own counsel. "What made you think of being a painter?" I asked. He shrugged his shoulders. "It happened that I had a knack for drawing. I got prizes for it at school. My poor mother was very proud of my gift, and she gave me a box of watercolors as a present. She showed my sketches to the pastor and the doctor and the judge, and they sent me to Amsterdam to try for a scholarship, and I won it. Poor soul, she was so proud. And though it nearly broke her heart to part from me, she smiled and would not show me her grief. She was pleased that her son should be an artist. They pinched and saved so that I should have enough to live on, and when my first picture was exhibited, they came to Amsterdam to see it. My father and mother and my sister and my mother cried when she looked at it." His kind eyes glistened. "And now, on every wall of the old house, there is one of my pictures in a beautiful gold frame." He glowed with happy pride. I thought of those cold scenes of his, with their picturesque peasants and cypresses and olive trees. They must look queer in their garish frames on the walls of the peasant house. The dear soul thought she was doing a wonderful thing for me when she made me an artist, but perhaps, after all, it would have been better for me if my father's will had prevailed, and I were now but an honest carpenter. Now that you know what art can offer, would you change your life? Would you have missed all the delight it has given you? "Art is the greatest thing in the world," he answered, after a pause. He looked at me for a minute reflectively. He seemed to hesitate. Then he said, "Did you know that I had been to see Strickland?" "You?" I was astonished. I should have thought he could not bear to set eyes on him. Stroeve smiled faintly. "You know already that I have no proper pride." "What do you mean by that?" He told me a singular story.